And thank you, everyone. Really wonderful occasion. It's quite an emotional thing for me as well. Rachel, the team, they've all been wonderful in putting it all together and everyone coming here this evening. Abigail asked me for a title a couple of months ago, and I haven't done talks for about 10 years now, so I'm a bit out of practice, but I thought something came to me about Monty Python. And I don't know, I mean, most of you will never have watched Monty Python, and probably those of you who have probably didn't find it very funny either. But they always ended their program when they said, and now for something completely different. Okay, so there's a bit of an echo of that because I'm not going to talk about open air, so that is different. But also, I tend to have a sort of a wish in life not to give the same talk twice, so I've never given this talk before. So we'll see how it goes. But again, it did seem quite an interesting thought about something different in the context of our mission here, because we're sort of sitting here somewhere now, and we're thinking about healthcare in a very different kind of context. And my experience has been along this sort of trajectory. Now, that image was made by the Stable Diffusion's software, and I fed into it some text from an early chapter of my book, and that's the image it gave me. And what that means to me is a lot about the experience of working through the 40 or 50 years of the impact of the computer on healthcare and walking up a staircase, except that guy, that person halfway up, they're sort of making the staircase as they go. And they've got various threads feeding in, and I sort of thought, okay, new disciplines, new professions, new organization of services, and this staircase is sort of angsting and moving towards something different, which is not terribly well articulated, have a sense of where we're trying to head to, but not a particularly good idea of how we're going to get there, or how much things are going to change along the pathway as we move up that staircase. And we tend to think of staircases in terms of careers, that we come into an organization at a fairly junior level and then we step up through. It's not like that in this field. The staircase sort of evolves and changes as you move up it, and sometimes it sort of evaporates away completely. There's a bit of, I don't know if you've played with your grandchildren, children, whatever, the game of snakes and ladders. But snakes and ladders, you roll a dice and you step onto a board, and then you move forward according to the dice. And if you hit the bottom of a ladder, you shoot to the top of the ladder. And if you land on the head of a snake, you fall down through. And the game of health informatics for me has been a bit like snakes and ladders. I mean, snakes are everywhere, you know, we all know that. But the ladders are also very complicated. We're having to make our own ladders, and sometimes they don't quite reach there. And so it's been a very evolving kind of scene. And I think this quote here from David Graeber, the philosopher, about the future, the hidden truth of the world is that something we make and could just as easily make differently. I think we need to recognize that this different world, there can be many different realizations. It can evolve in many different ways, this future that we're moving towards. Some of them are going to be good, some of them are not going to be what we're seeking for. And, you know, we've all got a responsibility to try and make the world that we're evolving towards a better world for the patients who are being served. Now, when I was writing the book, I drew a great deal on the writings of the philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead. And he sort of classified the three different components of my book in terms of adventure of ideas, anarchy of transition, and program for reform. And this staircase here, played out over the last 50 years, has probably cost the world trillions of dollars, pounds, euros, whatever. It's been a very expensive journey that has been traversed in this period of time. absolute adventure, massive amounts of change in terms of science and technology. Pretty anarchic developments in the context of how that has interacted with ways of delivering healthcare services and the way that they were scoped and enacted. And a pretty universal sense now that we've got to do things differently, but we're still in this process of creating the different that we have in mind for that. One of the great privileges I've had, I've been very, very lucky in my career, is meeting people like Max Perutz, for example, who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1962. And here he is working with his model of the hemoglobin protein, unraveling the structure. He described it as 30 years of pure physics, so that appeals to me as a physicist, that here was this eminent life scientist drawing on the field of physics. And here is the incredibly complicated model that he developed in his laboratory at Cambridge as he took the whole science on from what the Bragg brothers had been doing 60 years before this in shining X-rays through crystal structures and looking at the structures of diffraction patterns and inferring from there back to structures of what this molecule and other molecules would look like. And this was an absolutely incredible adventure. And as he said, it was 30 years of work, and he arrived at one protein, and lo and behold, last month, as Andrew Morris was just saying, there's Demi Hassibis and John Jumper with AlphaFold decoding the structure of 200 million proteins. And David Baker, they shared the prize with him, using the computer to design new proteins. It's just an amazing description, I think, of the adventure here, of the completely different scale of adventure that the world is involved in now compared to just 50, 60 years ago. And the computer is right at the heart of all of that. I related it at the same time to the parallel Nobel Prize last month for physics, which Geoffrey Hinton and John Hopfield were awarded this. People said, is this physics? But it's using the Boltzmann equations of statistical physics to the early algorithms of artificial intelligence. And they were awarded the Nobel Prize for this. Interestingly, Demi Hassibis, he studied Cambridge, his computer science, and he got interested in neuroscience, and he came to UCL, my university, so I know his PhD supervisor quite well. And out of that came DeepMind and all of what followed from that. But he worked in the same institute as Geoffrey Hinton, the computational neuroscience unit in the Institute of Neurology at Queen Square. And it's interesting that they're parallel personalities. If you listen to Demi Hassibis, he's very warmly optimistic about where he's heading, and I think with due cause. Geoffrey Hinton is more cautious in the context of where he thinks all of his work is getting to. And I think we're in that kind of a bridging domain at the moment. Excuse me a moment. So I just want to take some jumps back and then look forward. So this is where I started off in the field. I studied physics, as I was saying, but this is the world of the early 1970s in medical physics. These are the sorts of computers we had. These were the kinds of displays in neonatal intensive care. These were the same kinds of problems, neonates, people with hyaline membrane disease, things of this kind, where they were struggling to get their respiratory management sorted out. And we were taking the data from the Astrup machines and other devices, the early oxygen transducers, putting them into a system running on a PDP-11 computer. And in the PDP-11 computer, to get these interfaces right, we needed soldering irons. We had to create our own circuit boards. In terms of the software, the operating system wouldn't do what we wanted it to do, so we had to understand the code of the operating system, rewrite segments of it, in order to make the whole. So it was a hugely experimental kind of world that we were engaged in. very unreliable. All the disks were breaking down all the while and things of this kind. So it was an utterly chaotic world of immature technology, but getting itself into a world where there was clearly a need to organize data in new ways. I was incredibly lucky. There's me many years ago with my mentor and PhD supervisor, John Dickinson, who I dedicate the book to him in part, where he became professor of medicine at Barts, an institution with a history going back to 1123. So he said when he became professor of medicine there that he only wanted to create one post. He wanted to create a post for me in medical computing. And the dean sort of shock horror, you know, what on earth would a guy in physics coming into a department of medicine? I've worked in departments of medicine all my career. But John was a very practical engineer as well as a very insightful clinical scientist, encyclopedic knowledge of blood pressure regulation and the explosion of measurements happening in that era alongside what was going on in science. So on the top is the new mechanisms known over that period from 1900 to 2000 interacting with the control of human blood pressure. So the knowledge base of explosion there. And alongside here, Jan van Memmel, my colleague from the Netherlands, who charted the number of procedures ongoing in clinical practice against a stable level of hospital admissions. And these kinds of graphs were getting known at that sort of stage in the evolution of this story. So there's a great book by a man called Eric Topol, some of you may have read it, called Deep Medicine, How Artificial Intelligence Can Make Healthcare Human Again, 2019, really great book, where I'm sort of quoting him there. Modern medicine has lost, I mean, he's quoting it, he's a luminary clinical scientist in California. Modern medicine has lost its balance through the pursuit of optimization and monetization of cure at the expense of too little time and attention paid to care. And then he emphasizes period, he says. And there's another quotation, this is where we are today. Patients exist in a world of insufficient data, insufficient time, insufficient context, and insufficient presence, a world of what he's describing as shallow medicine. He's talking about his own experience in his own particular environment. And he's concerned, and he's a great advocate for artificial intelligence, all about the right balance of patients, doctors, and machines, accompanied by humanness to make the care in healthcare real again. Now that is quite a challenge. I grew up in a social care setting. My parents ran a children's home. I lived along 25 children, first 12 years of my life, coming from all sorts of complicated family backgrounds where they were removed from their families for one reason and another. So the social care dimension of this is something which is sort of fairly deep in me, and yet is actually coming out in a lot of what is being said here about the importance of maintaining the caring dimension. And I'm a bit of a book buff, I'm sorry about that, but I think this quote from Emerson from quite a few years before is something we need to bear in mind. By having a real other respond to me, I am spared one thing only, the worst cumulative effect of my own echo chamber of words. And words can be echo chambers, computer algorithms can be echo chambers, and we've got to be very cautious, and I think Heather was making this point, there are some areas of this we've got to be extremely cautious because this will change everything. Everything will change. We heard e-patient Dave this morning in that wonderful talk, and a lot of the ways he picks examples to illustrate patients and how they're getting involved in their care. I want to go back to another part, which is part of my history, and I hope I can get through this in sort of time. First half of my career, which led up to me getting my chair, and which I then moved on from there into the world of GARE and openEHR. But I got to know this guy, Arthur Guyton, who many of you who studied medicine, he was the last person to write single-handedly a whole textbook of medical physiology. And this is him with his wife, Ruth, in Jackson, Mississippi, where I visited them. John Dickinson, my mentor and supervisor, arranged for me to go and have time Guyton was, he trained in medicine, got polio in his early 20s, gave up and came back to Mississippi to become a luminary figure, subsequently the president of the American Physiological Society, building mathematical models of the human circulatory system and blood pressure control. And I'm not asking any of the detail of this, but you can see that this is a highly complex kind of environment that he's depicting and describing there, into the levels of complexity that only relatively few people in the field were following him in this endeavor. But it was a very earnest quest to sort of build from where physics might have been going in the world of modeling the weather, for example, building discrete models and then scaling them into making weather forecasts. And he was trying to do a similar thing with blood pressure regulation. This is PowerPoint, suggested some corrections to my slide layout, which I sort of interpreted that, rip it up and start again, but anyway. So John Dickinson and I went on a different route. We created, with colleagues at McMaster, the Max series of clinical physiology. I worked on it for 15 years. We published them through IRL, and then with Oxford University Press, they went to medical schools and other healthcare education establishments in about 1,000 places around the world. This is the model, MacPuff, of human respiration, and it built from a clinical point of view. All the problem exercises the students were given were real-life clinical problems of respiratory system control and management that would be encountered in intensive care or ventilation management. And we built much simpler models that we then explored how to pursue these into the medical education curriculum. And I, in parallel, got to know at Barts a lot of the intensive care doctors and so on and so forth. And we looked at this in the context of real-life data in intensive care. And that's an EHR drawing. I like these EHR woodcuts, and I use them in talks quite a bit. This one's called Order and Chaos. So we were trying to produce a very orderly description. That's our model in the middle. And then this was the data environment in which we were working. And it's not being, I mean, it sounds a bit pejorative, doesn't it? Sort of saying it's all a load of rubbish. It's not like that. But it is complex and it's context dependent and all manner of things. And this model and the models that we were producing in that kind of scope were not identifiable in the sense that you couldn't say, this is the representation within the model that will account for this set of data. And it was implicit that this path that I'd been on to try and do the physics with the modeling of the clinical physiology just came to a dead end. We published quite a few papers there. I got my chair and so on and so forth. But it wasn't going anywhere in terms of clinical medicine. It was quite interesting for education. So this is where my pathway detached quite a bit. And John, that was his family's choice. He died a few years ago, and that was their family choice of picture for him. In the middle there is the first woman dean on the right, Leslie Rees of Barts. She was the endocrinologist who unraveled the secret of enkephalins and endorphins. And she became dean of this institution, the first woman dean, and I was her first appointed professor. So she was quite engaged with me. And she said, I've just become dean. I want the medical students, and next door was the nursing school. She said, I want the medical students and the nursing students to align on a common pathway in terms of education in clinical skills. Not the same clinical skills, but putting them side by side. And she said, talk to John about this, and it's impossible for us to imagine, and the head of the nursing school, impossible for us to imagine putting a doctor in charge of that, or a nurse for that matter, because they would only argue all the while. So she said, I'm going to use you. So I got this role of sitting in the middle of, well, they all cooperated very well, actually. But in that kind of an environment of building multi-professional, multidisciplinary approaches. And the first person, I mean, the great thing with all projects like this is get good people around you. So this is Jane Dacre in her subsequent robes as president of the Royal College of Physicians. She went on to become, she was my first academic appointment into this clinical skills and informatics arena at Barts. And at a similar time, he's probably sitting here somewhere, I can't quite see him, Sam, but Sam Hurd was a trailblazing doctor in the East End of London in Hackney, and he was producing the Paradox system to computerize the work of the general practices in a consortium there. And it was about the time when onto the scene came the former medical director and subsequently chief executive of the University Hospital in Copenhagen, Niels Rossing, and in parallel, my great colleague to this day, Alan Rector, who really transformed formal methodology in the context of terminologies. And Sam came to me and asked me to come to a meeting and talk about a project which was targeting funds that Niels Rossing had produced to look at the architecture and organization of clinical records in the context of the information age. And the rest is sort of history from that. And I said, I'm not going to talk about openEHR because everyone here can talk about openEHR much better than me now. But this is where my staircase changed to a different staircase altogether. And for 30 years, it's been this story of GAIR to openEHR, 1990, 2010, to which point I then retired. And this was an early diagram that I produced in the context of beginning to systematize the requirements in and around the GAIR architecture. So I've got another few pictures here of some people who were really fundamental to me along that particular pathway. And I don't know if you can recognize the guy on the left. I'm not going to speak immediately about him. That's Octo Barnett. And the next one is Joe Milan, my colleague at the Royal Marsden Hospital. Two luminary figures. I'm going to have special slides about them. That's Martin Severs, who created the IHD-STO. That's Bill Elwood, who created openEYES. That's Stan Huff, who I knew less well, but who was a key person in the States, a successor in some ways to Homer Warner and Octo Barnett in the whole area of systematizing clinical records. So Octo, clinician, computer scientist. I met him, I used to see him at Harvard, and he was interested in what we were doing in the Mac series of models, and I was interested in what he was doing with mumps. And so that's where I met him. Joe was a lifelong colleague in the physics world of medicine with me, and I'll talk about him in a moment. And I think you all know Martin, Bill, and so Octo Barnett, an American Quaker, gives persistence a different sort of orientation. His clinical insight and pioneering spirit was sort of completely expressed in this document of 1977. And I can tell you, any policy document on the impact of computers on the organization of healthcare, all the messages that any subsequent policy document, I've reviewed them all through my book. It's all in this document from 40, 50 years ago. So it's very interesting that he had an amazing insight. He was really the founder of the story of mumps, and his insights in relation to the computerization of clinical data in a tractable form using basically key value stores and organizing that within the global variables of mumps transformed that whole field and still persists to the day in the InterSystems and the EPIC and other worlds, and absolutely transformational. Joe, a different story. He picked up and worked on the mumps story, and he was an engineering genius. He wasn't a clinician, but he worked in the middle of a clinical community. He was the first person to do radiotherapy treatment plans on 4K of computer with 32K of disk memory. And, you know, that was his sort of thing, to actually get clinically useful stuff out of a very limited computational resource. And getting to grips with data in the context of the whole of the Royal Marsden became his story of the next 20 years. I just want to show you this slide taken from an audit commission. This is a national review body. And the one on the left there is showing clinical approval and value for money. So it's a sort of a sigmoid curve of every NHS trust in the UK around about the year 2000. And the far left at the bottom there is less clinical approval and poor value for money. And rising up is getting greater clinical approval and value for money. And you see the red line, that's the Royal Marsden, that's Joe Milan, okay? And it's even better than that. Expenditure and obtaining information, so the amount of information they got for the money that they spent, same sigmoid curve. This time, the best ones are at the bottom left. There, the red line, that's the Royal Marsden. And here, information paperless. So getting beyond all the paper base and going to a paperless environment. Everyone talks about it. There, the Royal Marsden. The minister responsible for the NHS investment programme at the time said to me, I knew her quite well, where shall we launch our new national strategy? So I said, well, the Royal Marsden. So it was all done, all the great and the good there, magnificent kind of occasion. The national programme completely ignored all of that. And it was even more difficult than that. Joe had a really difficult time in holding his own in the clinical environment and the organisational environment of that trust. I just want to say that people who go on that climbing ladder that I've described in my stable diffusers picture there, they have to be pretty brave, resilient souls in that era. And these people were amazing people. So I just want to quickly now move on to where I think we're sort of heading to. And I'm picking up on what Eric Topol said about the need for something which had care very much more at its focus. And in my thinking of that, I'm thinking of the social care dimension of things, not been talked about a lot in this context here, but for my way of thinking, with my family background, my sense of working in the housing movement, working in many different areas where social inequalities translate, as Andrew Morris said, into ill health and problems of healthcare and sustaining healthcare, that we need something which keeps the mission that we're seeking very much in line with that broad context of health and social care, and not thinking about cure of disease exclusively outside of that context. So something which sits in that kind of way needs to be seen as the scope of the utility that we're imagining moving forward. And it's a daunting prospect. Every government that I've seen has shied away from this. They haven't enabled the money's being spent. It's happened again in the last 2 weeks. They've completely, in the UK, ignored that connectivity, that is lip service given to it. And I wanted just to mention this, which gives me encouragement in this, that I think we're halfway in a journey which is sort of like a Julius Caesar crossing of the Rubicon, crossing into something different. Finish? Okay, yeah, I'm pretty last 2 slides. And Penrose said, he studied dynamics of organizational behavior at Cambridge in his colleagues. And he worked out, if you have 100 people in the room, that there's so many different arguments that if 10 of them have got a common agenda, they will rule the day. So he described it as the rule of squares. And so I often think of it in that way, that if you start off with 100, then you need 10. If you have 10, you need 3. But going the other way, which is where you're heading now, you're somewhere between the 100 and the 10,000. And going from 3 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 10,000, in terms of human effort, they're probably pretty comparable. That is massively difficult to get to 10. Believe you me, I've got to 10 in openEHR, and I've got to 10 in other places. It takes a long time because of all the reasons we've been hearing about. But I'm not saying this is at all easy. This is another huge challenge. But scaling it out to where it needs to get in terms of healthcare of the future, we're on a trajectory like this. And that's very much where we're at. So just a couple of final slides. I'm sorry I've gone on a bit. It's a problem of old age, I'm afraid, talking to time. But I will be, hopefully. So I like this slide here of not trying to separate things out into disjoint activities. I like the 2 hands. They're drawing one another's story. And it's called Drawing Hands. It's another Escher wood print. So healthcare and informatics, I think they are 2 hands drawing one another's agenda. Lifespan and lifestyle, very much in a similar way. A more complicated one for us, I think, is this issue about globalization of technology and deglobalization of politics that we're living on today and exemplified in what's going on in America today and happening very widely across the world. That the technology is somehow And I don't think we completely understand involved in this deglobalization that's going on in the political space. And I think we need to think carefully about that. And these kinds of diagrams are also useful that we have different perspectives. There's bottom-up perspective, top-down perspective. The danger is that the top-downers walk down this picture here, and the bottom-uppers go the other way round. And in the illusion of the drawing, they sort of cross over and more or less stay in the same place. We can't sort of combat bottom-up and top-down. We need both, but we need to have a synergy which is effective and move forward. And it's the same way with innovators and standardizers and regulators, that we've got to give a space to all of that creative activity in the way that we imagine and evolve iteratively towards healthcare. This is a picture of various open-air folks. Kahneman coined the phrase adversarial collaboration. And I think open-air is brilliant in that regard. It's often been quite adversarial, but it's very collaborative. And many of you in the audience will see yourselves in those pictures there. So, very final thing, this is the other something different I'm doing. I've got somebody I'm working with, a chap called John, who has a passion as an optician and an engineer for doing something in this space here of getting modular low-cost prescription glasses fitted to any individual anywhere in the world within 30 minutes at a cost of something like £20 as things currently stand. I've got my pair. If you come to the book reading, etc., I'll show you. They give me 90, well, they're not fashionable items that you pay £700 for. But for me, in my everyday life, these do every bit as much as those £700 kits. And so we're into kits, regulatory approval, getting it all into an evaluation in the top service in optometry and visual science in the university in London. And after that, I've got the brief to take the whole of the technology to the global south. And we're talking at intergovernmental level on this. So this is my something different that I've been dedicating quite a bit more of my time to since leaving your world and on the side of your world. But it's something that is different for me. So thank you very much.